Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this fifth event of Conversation and Cocktail with a board member of the Washington Foreign Law Society. I'm Juliana Canet, the president of the Washington Foreign Law Society, which was established in 1952 to promote the knowledge and mutual understanding of international legal matter, comparative issue, and foreign law. So tonight we have the part two of our conversation started last week. And we have Mark Agras, Executive Director and Executive Vice President of the American Society of International Law, interviewing Rosa Celorio, Associate Dean for International and Comparative Legal Studies and Burnett Family Professional Lecturer in International and Comparative Law and Policy at the George Washington University Law School. So I hope, as usual, that you have your coffee, your cocktail, you relax, you have your cocktail handy and sit back, relax. Given the number of participants, you are all put on mute, so you will not be able to unmute yourself, but this doesn't mean that you will not be able to be interactive with us, especially with Rosa. Please write your question on the Q&A section of the Zoom chat. This seminar will be recorded and will be put on the Washington Foreign Law Society website, so you will have a chance to re-record or to see the previous cocktail conversation with more board member. So welcome, Mark. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Juliana, and welcome everybody. I'd also like to thank Aisha Maria Gringel for her work in organizing these sessions. It's always wonderful for the American Society to collaborate with the Washington Foreign Law Society, and we do so very frequently, and encourage all of you, if you aren't actually members of both societies, to please become members. I think you will find it's a wonderful way to engage with the international law community in Washington and around the world. It is truly a delight to share this hour with my friend and colleague, Rosa Celorio. A couple of weeks ago, during part one of our conversation, she interviewed me about my life and career. And having obtained many damaging admissions from me, she is now the subject of this interview, and it's my pleasure to return the favor. Juliana already gave you her very impressive academic titles. I should note that in the course of her work as Associate Dean and as a lecturer at George Washington, she is very engaged on a number of issues that may come up today. She writes and teaches on the US legal system, on regional protection of human rights and the rights of women. And before she went to George Washington, she spent more than a decade at the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights as a senior attorney there, where she oversaw, among other things, the work of the specialized rapporteurs on women, LGBTI persons, indigenous peoples, racial discrimination, children, and older persons. So really a very wide-ranging brief in which she did a lot of amazing work. So we're really proud to have her with us. I'm going to ask her a few questions to get us started, but we will be sure to leave time for your questions as well. I can't promise we'll get to all of them, but we will do our best. So we'll be using the Q&A function on your screen. So if you have a question, please feel free to type it in at any time, and we'll be glad to take as many of those as we possibly can. I see first question has already come in, but let me begin with some questions that I've prepared. First of which is to ask Rosa about how you found your way to the work you are doing now. You've had a wonderful and varied career in international law, including many different professional experiences. So when you entered law school, did you know you wanted to pursue a career in international law? And what was your first international legal job?
Well, thank you, Mark, and thank you for that wonderful introduction. And I just want to say how much of an honor it is for me to continue having this conversation with you. I have a great deal of respect for you and the work of ASO. And thank you so much to Juliana Kane and Aisha Maria Grinjo for organizing this amazing events at the Washington Foreign Law Society. I think this is a wonderful thing to do, especially during the COVID pandemic, for all of us to stay connected and to learn a little bit more about one another. In response to your question, Mark, I didn't exactly know that I wanted to enter international law. I've never really had a plan career-wise. But what I can tell you is that since I was very young, I was fascinated by international affairs. I mean, I was the kind of young person that really followed international politics and social issues, and I was fascinated by the world. I was able to travel some when I was growing up. And for me, those were very formative experiences to be able to see countries outside of Puerto Rico. I grew up in Puerto Rico, which is a wonderful place, but it's an island. So it was wonderful to see other countries. And I think also the experiences of my father really shaped me as well. I mean, I'm the daughter of a Cuban immigrant. He was a refugee in the United States, and basically his entire family was in exile in the United States. And then later he moved to Puerto Rico, where he met my wonderful mother. And I think that I grew up with all these refugee stories. I grew up with all these exile stories. And that really opened my eyes to the fact that there was a world out there and that it was important to discover it in many ways. I think college was very important for me as well. I was very fortunate to be able to study in Washington, D.C., which is a fantastic place to study. I was suddenly in a classroom with people from all over the world. And for me, that was an incredible experience. I mean, the multiculturalism of my academic experience, you know, the fact that there wasn't only people from Puerto Rico in the world, you know, for me, it was a very important conceptual time. I was also able to study in Strasbourg, France for 1 year, and that was marvelous. I mean, I was able to focus on the Council of Europe and the European Union and the work of the European Court of Human Rights, learn to speak French fluently. I love languages. I mean, that was another thing that really connected me to international affairs, so that was a very important time. And then I think where things really clicked was in law school. When I was in law school, for me, law school was a very important time because I learned that I could do practical things with the love that I had for international affairs. I learned that I could be a writer, that I could be a researcher, that I could be an advocate, that I could defend clients, that I could do a lot of things in a more concrete way in the area of international law. For me, law school was very important, and I think two experiences in particular were key. One of them is that I was able to do a summer externship at the United Nations Development Fund for Women in Ecuador, and this was funded by my law school, so I will forever be very grateful to my law school for funding my first human rights opportunity, and Amnesty International as well helped me with funding. And it was just amazing. I was suddenly working at the United Nations, and for me, that was something that really drew me to pursue a career in international law. And I also spent my spring breaks in Haiti. I actually went with a group of students and faculty from my law school. We went to Haiti to do human rights and humanitarian work. And I loved the fact that there was meaning to what we were doing. I mean, I liked the fact that we were helping people. We were trying to discover how people lived, like, you know, what their needs were, what their problems were. And I think that was a very important formative experience for me as well, that really connected me to international law, or at least increased that passion for international law.
Wonderful. And how did that then become your career? What was that first position that you had in international legal practice, as it were?
Well, the curious thing, Mark, is that I wanted to do international law, but as many international law practitioners, I started with a job in the United States. I actually didn't start with an international law job. I actually worked in a labor and employment litigation firm for 2 years. And then I did it for 2 years, and I was like, I think it would be important to start kind of delving more into international affairs, you know, in terms of my career. And it just so happens that basically the United Nations Development Fund department that I had worked at, they were looking for a legal consultant to work in the United Nations in New York, and they remembered me. So when I reached out to them, there was this opportunity. So I basically packed my suitcases, took this giant leap of faith. I didn't even have a long-term job. It was a short-term consultancy. And I remember moving to New York, you know, and basically all I had were literally my suitcases, my law degree, my languages, you know, and my education. And I was like, I'm going to try to make this work. And I have to say, it was an amazing experience. I mean, I was suddenly in the United Nations and at the headquarters in New York, and I was managing programs related to women and human rights. And I just fell in love with the area. I just thought it was absolutely fascinating. I met all these civil society organizations. I met all these United Nations officials. It was really a very important point for me to do that United Nations experience. But I think probably what really, really solidified for me the career in human rights was really my work for the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. You know, I joined the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights in 2004. I was there for 13 years, and I was basically brought in to manage the rapporteurship on the rights of women. I mean, that was my first job at the commission, although I ended up holding a lot of different kinds of roles when I was at the commission. And I remember that experience was incredible. I met so many human rights victims. I met so many people that had lost everything in life, you know, that had gone through the worst. And they all wanted to share their stories with me. And that really moved me. I mean, the way I saw it was like, if they're sharing their stories with me, and if I am here, it's because I have to do something about it. I have to help them in some way. And I have to say, I credit a lot my family for this too. I mean, my family really raised me thinking about other people, you know, having empathy for other people. And for me, when I saw all of those stories and when I heard all of those stories, I really felt that I needed to help, you know, and that really solidified the passion that I have for human rights and international human rights law. And I love, it's something that I still love doing today in many ways.
Well, you project that love of the work that you do, so it's really wonderful to see. You stayed with the Inter-American Commission for, you said, 13 years?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What was it that led you eventually to choose a different path and to go into academia? Well,
I started teaching at GW. I'm actually very grateful to GW because while I was an attorney at the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, an opportunity came up to work as a part-time professor, as an adjunct professor for GW Law School. So I started teaching there at the same time that I was still doing my work as a senior attorney for the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. And I have to say, it was such a phenomenal experience. I was working with students, I was working with faculty. I loved the fact that I was able to work with all these young people, you know, and really discuss a lot of the problems of our time in a classroom, you know, which is not something, or at least reflect on them, which is something that is very difficult to do in practice because you're always moving and you have to work so much. And I also started writing. I started publishing a lot, and I realized that I liked both the teaching and the writing part, and I loved the idea of working with students. You know, I developed all these great working relationships with students, and I was like, wow, this would be an incredible job to have eventually, you know, full time. And also I started thinking, you know, about, you know, wow, what kind of social contribution I would be able to make from academia, because I would be working with young minds, you know, I will be working with people that are really defining their values and the ways they're going to be attorneys in the future. You know, what better way, you know, to help shape the new generation of international law attorneys, and to be one of the basically advisors and teachers and mentors and people, you know, somebody that worked directly with them. So for me, that was a big part of the motivation. And in many ways, it was kind of like a natural transition in many ways. It kind of flew very nicely in many ways.
You may already have answered this next question with what you've just said, but what is your favorite part of the job as Associate Dean for International Comparative Law?
I mean, I love working with students. I mean, and I think my students know that I love working with them. I have to say, like, I'm very lucky. We have students from more than 40 countries in the world. I always say that we have like a mini United Nations at GW, you know? And I get to advise them. I get to organize events with them. I get to teach them. We collaborate so much together. I love hearing their stories. And I love walking their path along with them while they're at GW. I feel like they come to GW and they're with us at a specific moment in time. And I'm able to help them and advise them, you know, and support them in that specific moment in time. And one thing that I love doing is making sure that they eventually have careers also in the area of international law. One thing that really helps me is that I know basically a lot of organizations and entities, and knowing the field really helps me also help students be able to forge careers in international law. And I love mentoring as well. I mean, I think that when you're in academia, mentoring is such an important thing, and I've benefited a lot from mentoring as well. So I really take it very seriously. And at the end of the day, I just think it's such a fulfilling job. You know, it's a very warm job. It's a job that there's always good energy. There's always hope. There's a lot of wonderful things that come out of academic freedom. And so I really value the opportunity. And I also I'm really grateful to GW for offering me the opportunity as well. So I'm very happy that I'm there. And a lot of my students are connected to the call. So I give a shout out to them as well. A lot of them have had a really difficult year with COVID-19. And I've seen them really face COVID-19 with determination, with grit, with resilience. And I really stand in admiration of them today.
Well said. And I think they're lucky to have you too. The role that you play in advising law students, I think it'd be of particular interest to our audience today. What advice would you like to share with law students who may be listening about how to break into the field?
I think doing externships is paramount in this field, especially in a field like international law. It's an important way to have employers get to know your skills, to get to know how good you are at your craft. And it's also a very important way for you to make contacts. The reality is that this is a field that's very driven by contacts. And many of us, like me, for example, I mean, I grew up in Puerto Rico. I didn't necessarily have the contacts to get into international law. So for me, the contact with international law was eventually doing that unpaid work, you know, to make sure that I actually met people that eventually would notice that I could do the work, and eventually that opened up more opportunities. So I do think doing those externships is very important. I think also working on your craft is very important. I always tell students it's very important to work on your writing, to work on your research, to work on your skills as a lawyer. The reality is that regardless of the context, you know, when you are good at your craft, eventually work follows that, you know? So if you are interested in a career in international law, it's very important for you to become good at what you do. Try to become an expert, you know, write about your specific subject matter, read upon your specific subject matter, become a person of substance and a voice that's important to follow. And a lot of jobs come after that. I am a big fan, as you know, Mark, of ASO. I mean, I think the American Society of International Law and the Washington Foreign Law Society are very important organizations to get involved in, because they're great opportunities. They're great organizations, not only for the international law issues that get discussed in these organizations, but also they're great organizations for networking. You meet so many wonderful professionals when you're connected to these types of organizations. So I always tell students, follow the ASO annual meeting, get involved with the working groups, attend the Washington Foreign Law Society events. Like at the end of the day, I do think this bring very valuable opportunities. But to close, I think is very important. And I always tell this to all my students. Regardless of what kind of career path you have in the future, be kind to everyone. Be kind to everyone, be good, and never forget where you come from. At the end of the day, we really need more of that in the world right now. And when you're practicing international law, you have the ability to make a difference in so many people's lives. And I think no matter what, even if you do private work, even if you work in a law firm, that I think is very important to preserve that kindness and that empathy and that passion and that hope. I think it's important to stay hopeful too. I know international law has had a lot of challenges in the past few years, but I think maintaining your hope and being positive that we can find solutions to the problems, I think that's very important also for a young person as well. I try to stay hopeful, even though the problems are very large.
I will ask you about some of those problems a little bit later. But why don't we turn to a challenge that perhaps you have faced in your career? As an example for the students who may be listening today, you've explained what kind of advice you would give to students and recent graduates. What was the biggest challenge that you faced in your career, and how did you overcome it?
I grew up in Puerto Rico, and I grew up in this fantastic family. I love my parents. I think my mother is connected to this call, and I have to say, I couldn't have grown up with better parents. They taught me how to be good, how to have empathy, how to work hard, how to dream, how to have passion, how to be dedicated, But I grew up in an environment in Puerto Rico where I didn't necessarily grow up with contacts. I didn't necessarily have contacts to get into international affairs. I was just a hardworking young person that wanted to have a career in international affairs and international law. And the reality is that I also looked very different from a lot of people that were making the decisions in international law. I'm a woman from Puerto Rico. I'm Latinx. English is not my first language. The reality is that I was a little bit different from a lot of the international law or international affairs experts and a lot of the decision makers in this area, right? So for me, I think one challenge was how to get into the field and how to develop those contacts, how to be able to have an employment in the area and how to be able to build a reputation in the area and actually be able to contribute to the area. And the thing is, this is a challenge actually that a lot of my students face as well. And at the end of the day, I do think that you can make your own contact and you have a role in making your career as well. And I think, for example, those externships are very important. Writing about specific issues related to international law is very important as well. I've always published a great deal. And I do think that that's important because people know what you think. They know your voice, they get to know you through your writing in many ways. I think that's important. I think getting involved with the big associations is important as well, with ASO, with Washington Foreign Law Society, the ABA. There's many associations, that really provide a space, and for me, associations have always been a great place, to get to know people. I think also something that I really worked on a lot is I wanted to make sure that I was good at my job, and I've always worked hard, to make sure that I can write in different languages, to make sure that I can speak in different languages, to make sure that I can communicate in different languages. And I also, especially, in that time frame that I was managing different kinds of expertise, especially during my United Nations work and also my commission work, I always made sure that I was up to date with current events and making sure, that I could be as good as possible as a human rights attorney. So, and I'm also very resilient, and I tell people that it's very difficult for me to give up. I'm very persistent. And I'm really the kind of person that really thinks that when a door closes for you, another one opens. I really believe that. And I've always seen that in my career. There's been moments in which I want a specific thing, but it doesn't happen at that specific moment, but then it eventually does. you know? And I think also being patient and being flexible is very important when you're doing something different. You know, the reality is that sometimes you think you want something specific and then another opportunity comes up that's even more wonderful. And you didn't even know that that was particularly there. I mean, I think if somebody would have asked me, 20 years ago, oh, yes, you're eventually going to be associate dean for international law at UW Law School, I would have been like, never in my wildest dreams, I thought that coming from Puerto Rico and growing up in Puerto Rico and growing up in an island, I was going to be able to hold a position like the one that I hold today. Like, I wasn't even able to dream about it because I didn't even know that eventually there was going to be a position like that I could hold. So I always tell students, find what you're passionate about and become really good at it, and then let fate work itself out in some ways, but also be persistent, be patient, be flexible, and of course do everything you can to make those contacts, because I do think those contacts are very important at the end of the day. But you can make them even if you don't come from an environment where the contacts are there.
Very good. Well, you mentioned your biggest challenge. Is there a sense in which that biggest challenge is also one of your biggest advantages?
It could be. It could be. I mean, at the end of the day, like, I think I'm very proud to have grown up in Puerto Rico. And I think it was such a wonderful place to grow up because I grew up bicultural. I grew up speaking two languages. I kind of grew up in a place that doesn't really have a definition, a political definition, right? And without getting into the politics, the reality is that I grew up with a cross between the American culture and the Latin American culture. So I think in many ways, I always tell people that I think growing up in Puerto Rico kind of exposed me since very young to a very multicultural way of seeing things. And I think that probably has helped me connect with a lot of people internationally. It kind of gave me a natural connection to international law. Spanish is my first language, so that helps me communicate with the world. And I think in some ways, maybe the challenges have also helped me in many ways. And I think challenges are also good because they kind of keep you humble in many ways. I think challenges also remind you that you're human and that you have to work hard for things, and that at the end of the day, it's important to be dedicated and it's important to appreciate what you have to do. I appreciate a lot what I have and what I've been able to do in my professional life, and I feel very lucky, and I'm very humbled by it too. I take it very seriously. Like, I think it's important to continue working to make sure that we see international law advanced and enforced, and I hope that I can help in that way.
Well, why don't we move to some of the issues that concern you in international law today? What would you say are the most pressing issues in the field?
I mean, I think at the end of the day, that's a difficult question to answer because we have so many issues. But I think discrimination and inequality are at the top of the list. I think a lot of the social problems that we have around the world and here in the United States are really connected to the fact that we still live in societies that are very discriminatory, that discriminate on the basis of race, that discriminate on the basis of sex, on the basis of age, and many other factors. And a lot of what we're seeing with COVID-19, for example, right now, is a worsening in many ways of that inequality and that discrimination. It's not that COVID-19 created the problems were there. It's just making them worse. I think another big problem is that, and I know that this is larger than international law, is the fact that around the world, we're still resolving a lot of problems with violence, a lot of problems, and that really concerns me. At the end of the day, I'm a big advocate for peace. I'm a big advocate for nonviolent responses to problems, and it really concerns me the use of violence at such a frequent basis in every country in the world. And I think that's something that's of such large concern. And I would say I would add a third. I am very concerned about climate change as well, and the way we treat the earth. I mean, at the end of the day, I do think that's one of the largest problems of our time: environmental degradation, the lack of adequate protection of the environment, and I do hope that COVID-19, that we can find, ways to improve COVID-19 and find solutions so that we can actually move on in many ways and kind of discuss more, the problems that we have with the environment, because I do think climate change is something that's a big concern right now as well.
Absolutely. And do you see international law as a part of the solution, as the solution?
I definitely see international law as part of the solution. And I think that especially with a problem like with discrimination and inequality, we have so many international legal standards related to discrimination and inequality. The problem is that these are very complex problems, so it's not only about the law. You have to change society, you have to change culture, you have to, in some ways, you have to work with different generations. These are problems that really start at a very early stage and they go beyond legal. And I think with climate change, I do think that international law is definitely part of the answer. If one thing international law has done well, in my view, especially thinking of human rights law, which is the area that I'm more involved with, is that it has defined a set of minimum obligations for states, and we have all these standards at the universal level and at the regional level that are really applicable to environmental protection. And I think they're very applicable to the adaptation and mitigation strategies that we need to follow when it comes to climate change. And I think also COVID-19 is giving us important opportunities to reflect on specific issues as a global community. I mean, the world in many ways has stopped, right? And I think when the world stops, it's also a moment of reflection of where do we want to go forward? Where do we want to go after COVID-19 is gone, and we don't want to go to the same place. I mean, the reality is that we had this huge climate change problem, and we want to make sure that we continue in a trend where there's a full commitment from states to address climate change and non-state actors as well. I mean, it's not only states at the end of the day,
Well, as you mentioned, the standards are largely in place in many of these areas, thanks to decades of the building of international law, legal structures, legal concepts, legal instruments. But the implementation has lagged. What do you think one can do about that today?
I think that's a very important question, Mark, because at the end of the day, if you ask me, that's probably one of the biggest challenges international law faces today. I mean, the effectiveness issue, the lack of enforcement, et cetera. And I think at the end of the day, we have to work a lot with states. We have to. The reality is that we have to train, we have to socialize international law, we have to make it, we have to make it part of the political will. We have to make sure that this is a priority. I mean, I think at the end of the day, part of the problem with international law is that the language is there, but you need all these conditions to be able to enforce it, and the conditions are not there. Just basic budgets to implement laws, There's a lot of issues there and a lot of preconditions, but the preconditions are not necessarily there. We've been so fixated on developing international law that we haven't really been fixated on the enforcement. And I think also we have to work with society in general as well, that society knows about international law. For me, international law is about the people. It's not about a select few. But unfortunately, in most countries of the world that I visit, international law is only known by a select few. It's not really known by the general population. And I do think that we have to also work a lot to make sure that we disseminate knowledge about international law and what does it mean and how do we use it? How do we enforce it in courts? How do we avail ourselves from it? If not, it's an abstract concept. And I think we have a long way to go in terms of going from that abstract to the practice, especially in areas like the one that I'm involved in human rights. There's so much we have to do to improve enforcement. Long way to go.
Yes, we do you see any particular institution or instrument that you think holds the promise of bringing about some of that change in public attitudes and awareness?
I'm a big believer in multilateralism, and that's because I basically had most of my international law career in multilateral organizations, you know, first at the United Nations and then at the Organization of American States. And I still work a lot with multilateral institutions in my academic role. And I've seen the weaknesses. I've seen the weaknesses, but I've also seen the strengths. And one thing that will never cease to amaze me is how you walk through the United Nations doors and you go to the coffee house and there's people from 20 different countries having a coffee together. And I know that these are very bureaucratic entities, and I know these are entities that are also very driven by politics. I've seen that in my career in many ways, but these are also entities that get states together, that sit them in the same space. And at the end of the day, we need that. A lot of the problems that we're having in the world is because states are not necessarily talking to each other. And I do believe, I'm a big believer in multilateralism, even with I recognize the challenges too. I saw them. I saw them. I mean, there were many ways in which I was at the United Nations in very delicate moments, you know, and I was at the OAS in very delicate moments. And I remember moments in which I wish the OAS was doing more. I wish the United Nations was doing more, you know, but there were also moments in which I was like, wow. So suddenly there's this crisis and look at all the people that suddenly are sitting in this room just because of the name of the organization. So I am a big believer of multilateral organizations, and I am a big believer of our human rights treaties. I mean, at the end of the day, we're talking about 80% of the world has ratified these treaties. And I know that they're not adequately implemented, but it says something that you have 80% of the world that has ratified the treaties. And I still harbor hope for them, you know, not only the global ones, but the regional ones. You know, I think they're incredible instruments. It's just that we have to find creative and new ways to use them. The traditional naming and shaming is not necessarily working. You know, we have to find different ways of how to use them in a way that they're really conducive to being enforced and that really affect people's lives, you know. But I really, at the end of the day, really lies on governments and states in many ways. And also we have all these non-state actors, and that we can be talking about for hours. We really have to figure out what to do with non-state actors in international law. And I think a lot of institutions are actually trying to figure that out. You know, we've been seeing a lot of very interesting standards related to non-state actors. I'm happy to see them. I really welcome them. And I think a lot of it is how to put them into action, you know, how to work with corporations, you know, how to work with like even international organizations, you know, how to work with private individuals. You know, there's a lot of different kinds of non-state actors that we have to also figure out how to work with them in international law. I think they're important. It's actors that are all over the world, you know.
It sounds like it all keeps coming back to education in one sense or another. You think so?
It's huge. I mean, I think at the end of the day, education is really the pillar of a lot of the future of how those international treaties are used, for example. And remember also I mean, it's funny, I was having one of my human rights courses today, right? And it was funny, we were talking precisely about this issue. We were talking about CEDAW particularly, you know, the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. We were talking about how do you ensure implementation of CEDAW? Because we know there's a lot of challenges, you know? And at the end of the day, most people around the world don't know what CEDAW is. I mean, that's number one, you know? And also, I think you have to work with lawyers too, to make sure that this is part of their legal culture, since they're at the education phase. I mean, I think international law should be part of the core curriculum of law schools. And this is not only in the United States, but all over the world. There are countries in which it is, you know? And I think that's important because when you're working like me at a law school level with young attorneys that are learning to have their relationship with the law. I think it's important the messages that we also send to them. You know, it's important to send them a message that this is important and that they're going to have to use it in their career, and to explain to them why we have international law too. I mean, we have the traditional international law, but we have many areas of international law that have been deeply shaped by world wars, and all the events that have driven what we understand as international law today. And unless you join a human rights course or you join an international law course, it's very difficult to have that history. And I think it's important that to have that as the core. There's a lot of questions that I get in class that I'm like, I wish that this was part of the 1L curriculum.
Mm-hmm. And how much do you attribute to the prevalence of disinformation or misinformation or fake news or whatever we want to call it these days? You mentioned that CEDAW is little understood. People don't know what it means, what it says. I think of the Convention on the Rights of the Child in a similar way. But even worse, they know things about those conventions that aren't true.
I mean, that's a huge problem we have now. I mean, the problem of like fake news and disinformation and the information that's coming out in the media. And I'm very concerned, to be honest with you, about the challenges that we're seeing to access to information that really has the guarantees that we would like to see in international law. I mean, I think we have a role as educators to make sure that our students receive information critically. You know, it's something that I work with a lot with our students. You know, when we're, for example, in my classes, I have one class that is about the U.S. legal system. So we follow very closely, of course, what's happening in the U.S. is one of the most fascinating countries to study in the world, especially in a year like this. And I'm always telling them, you know, watch all media outlets. Don't watch only one, you know, because you will get closer to getting the full story if you watch all of them, as opposed to just watching one or the other. You know, I think we also have, we have to communicate certain values to our students. And I think one of the values is make sure you think critically, make sure that you don't take things without analyzing them and making sure they are real. And I think that's what I'm concerned about, that there's a lot of persons that unfortunately don't have that value, that they don't understand the need to do that. But I think we have a role as educators to make sure, you know, that the new generations do have that value, and that they do analyze information critically, and that they do their research too. You know, it's okay to do your research. It's okay to not be in agreement. You know, it's okay to also do your own studying. And I think that's important to do as well, you know?
Absolutely. I'm watching the clock because I do want to leave room for questions from some of the people who have been sending them in. So let me just ask a couple of final questions of my own, and then we'll turn to the questions in the Q&A. So one question that you almost touched on when you talked about your personal background. I wanted to ask who has been the most influential person in your life, and that can be a person who has brought you to international law in some way, or just more generally. How would you respond to that question?
Well, that's the easiest question that you have asked me today, and that one's very easy. For me, it's my mother. My mother has had an incredible influence in the person that I am today, and also in the career that I've had, and I really credit her for a lot of what I've been able to accomplish in my life. And I think probably the most special part about my mother is that she taught me that no matter in which position you were or where you were in the world, it was very important to be a good, a kind, and a very empathetic person, to have compassion for everyone around you, you know, and to really see the world in a way that you don't discriminate against people, you know, that you really treat everyone equally. And she also taught me that it was okay to do that and also be a strong leader, you know, and a strong attorney, that wasn't a sign of weakness, that was a sign of a very strong professional in many ways. And I really credit her for this. I also send her a big hug. She's actually connected to this call. She's never heard me talking about my career, and I send her a big hug. And gracias, mami, te quiero mucho. I love her very much and I miss her. I haven't seen her in a while because of COVID-19. So I send her a big hug and I credit her for everything that I'm talking about today in many ways, you know, and the values that you grew up with are so important. They really stay with you. And I grew up with very important values and I credit my mother for that in many ways.
Well, we send her our very best wishes from the Washington Foreign Law Society as well. Hope that she and all your family are keeping safe. Let me ask you one last question, and then we're going to go to the list of questions we've been receiving. And that is a question you asked me at the end of our session a couple weeks ago. And I got, when I gave the answer, I got a lot of responses afterwards because it was a somewhat surprising answer, I suppose. So perhaps the same thing will happen now. And that question was, if you weren't a lawyer, what would you be doing?
That's a great question. And I still remember your answer, Mark. It was great. I think in my case, I would have been an interpreter. I mean, I love languages, you know, so, and that was one of my big connections to international affairs when I was growing up. So probably I would have been an interpreter. I think I would have been happy living a life that I was surrounded by languages. And it would have connected me to the multicultural world as well. So I probably an interpreter would have been what I would have been. So not as interesting as a classical musician, Mark, but you know.
Pretty interesting, though. That's great. Well, let me go to our questions, and there's still time if you have a question to submit it using the Q&A function. But we do have plenty of questions now, and let me start asking a few of those. First question: what does academic scholarship have to say regarding legal protections for women who are forcibly displaced?
You know, that's a wonderful question. And I love that question because I actually worked a lot with the forced displacement of women when I was actually practicing as a human rights attorney. The reality is that academia hasn't covered that much that issue, but you do have a lot of coverage of the issue by international organizations with another lens. I mean, not necessarily an academic lens. I actually would like to see more coverage of the issue. However, I'm talking about English-speaking academia. If you go, for example, to a place like Colombia that has some of the best academics in the world, a country like Colombia, and that they have a huge forced displacement problem because of the armed conflict, and they have all these judgments from the Constitutional Court that address the issues related to forced displacement. There you'll have more academic studying, but in Spanish. You know, a lot of the studies and the scholarship has come out in Spanish. So it really depends also on where the academic sector is located. In the US, I haven't seen that much, but international organizations have released a great body of work. And it's something that I would be very happy to share some of as well.
Great, great. Next question. I think we've covered this one pretty well, but I'll ask it anyway and see if you have anything you'd like to add. And that is, how has your cultural or ethnic background influenced your professional development and professional opportunities? I think you have actually addressed it, but is there anything you want to add?
Well, I think it's a wonderful question. I love being from Puerto Rico. Like I'm very proud of it. And I think that it really helped me develop a bicultural view of the world since very young. You know, I grew up with the two languages. I grew up in the middle of the United States and Latin America in many ways. And I do think that those experiences shape you. My father, you know, who I loved very much, was also a Cuban immigrant and a refugee and an exile. And I think all of those experiences really have shaped the way I see international law. From international law is for the people, you know, it should be for everyone. This is why I'm such a big proponent of, you know, a world free from discrimination and equality. And I think that having that bicultural background in many ways allowed me to connect, you know, to international law in many ways and to people in international law. And I'm very happy for it too, because it drove me, you know, to really search for those international opportunities, to learn different languages. So I really credit my background too for helping me get into this field and at least have an understanding of the field that's very wide, you know, that I cast the net very wide. It's not only it's not only the United States, you know, I've never seen the world that way. And I'm very happy and I'm very grateful that my experience growing up in Puerto Rico really opened my eyes to that, you know, to the fact that there was a world out there, that it wasn't only Puerto Rico and the United States, but that there was a world to really discover, and that viewpoint counted, you know, that it wasn't only my viewpoint, that the viewpoint of, you know, persons around the world is very important and must be valued as well.
Great. Here's a question that sort of connects the two parts of your professional life. The questioner asks, have you continued to be engaged with the Inter-American Commission during your time at GW in the course of your academic career, and particularly with reference to rights of women and LGBTI persons and indigenous communities, all of whom you worked with so closely when you were at the Commission?
One of the most wonderful parts of my job is that I can stay engaged. I'm still very engaged with the international human rights law world. And of course, the regional protection system for the Americas is one of my favorite components because I was there for a really long time and I'm still very actively involved in their work. I'm a legal advisor for cases before the Inter-American Court. I mean, there's a lot of things that I do that connect me to that world. And I also teach. I teach a seminar on regional protection of human rights. And of course, the Inter-American system has a great deal of coverage there. And I also write a lot and publish in these areas as well. I mean, it's something that's marvelous that you can do when you're an associate dean at GW, that I have this role as program director that's very connected to students and academic advising and running this program, but I can also teach and write as well. And I would say probably my human rights work is more in that teaching and writing part. And I can also continue being involved in the area of international human rights law, which is wonderful. You know, I'm fascinated by issues related to human rights, and I follow very closely what happens with the Inter-American system. It's a very important place for victims, you know. I learned that when I was there.
Next question is, I was wondering if Professor Celorio could share her approach on teaching public international law to undergraduate students as opposed to JD students. Really interesting question. We haven't really talked about undergraduates, or for that matter, secondary school instruction. But we did touch on the idea that it's exceptionally important not just to speak among ourselves to other international lawyers, but also to educate the broader population about the importance of international law. So I wonder how you would respond to that question.
I think it's actually a wonderful question. I mean, I took international law when I was in college. I mean, my first exposure to international law wasn't in law school. It was actually when I was in college. And I loved that class. I loved the fact that there were all these legal instruments that were connected to international affairs. And I think that at the undergraduate level, it's a wonderful place to start studying international law because you still don't have, there's a lot that happens in law school. You know, as soon as you start law school, you are thrown so much information and you have to do so much legal analysis of so many issues that you really, in many ways, have to shift your mindset and suddenly become a lawyer. What I love about teaching international law at an undergraduate level is that you don't have to go through that process yet. You can actually appreciate international law for its role in society, for its role in international affairs. And there's a lot of international law issues that are so connected to political issues, to social issues, that I think if you start at the undergraduate level, it gives you more of a policy view in many ways of what international law is. And then when you go into law school, you know, you kind of can shift that mindset more into what attorneys actually do, you know, the litigation of cases and analyzing international law through the view of cases and treaties and things like that. So I do think that teaching international law at the undergraduate level must be amazing. It's something that I would love to do at some point, now that you mention it, you know, because I think it's a different kind of mindset. You know, when I was in college, I certainly wasn't thinking the way that when I was in law school about international law. And it was wonderful, I have to say. So, and I do think that is something that we need more at our universities in general, you know?
Keeping that openness.
Yes.
I agree with you. Well, we are coming up on the hour, so I'd like to combine the last two questions together into one question about practitioners who may be interested in teaching law school. Very interesting question from actually a senior member of the Washington Foreign Law Society. Do you have a recommendation?
Member should contact me.
Yeah, you, of course, just pick up the phone. The first question is, how can a practitioner transition to teaching at law school? That's part one. And the second part is for those undergraduates who went on and became law students and are now looking for a job in the international legal field. Any particular thoughts? I know you spend a lot of time counseling them on this very question, but if there are any particular takeaways you'd like people to leave this session with.
Well, one thing for the senior practitioner, that there are openings that come up in law schools to teach as adjuncts. Like I would start as an adjunct professor. You know, I think that's a great way of getting your feet wet into teaching and to understanding how academia works. And I think there's something wonderful about teaching as an adjunct because you bring the practice to the classroom, you know? Like when I was practicing, I remember that suddenly I would be litigating a case and then that night I was teaching about the case in my class, you know? There's something very, and students love those war stories, you know? They love the stories of real practitioners. So we really, really value our adjuncts. There are a lot of adjunct law opportunities in the area of international law. So it's definitely something that I would encourage you to look at. And many of these opportunities are publicized, but sometimes it's good to contact, you know, the program directors for international law in the different law schools to keep you in mind, you know, for when opportunities arise. You know, a lot of practitioners contact me. I love when practitioners contact me because we have such great practitioners in Washington, D.C. And usually what I do is like, basically, I know that you're interested. So when there is a specific opportunity and something that matches your skills and interests, I may be able to contact you and give you the opportunity. So there's many ways of doing this, but I would definitely pursue it. And I think it's wonderful when practitioners teach because students love it. Students are like, oh my God, I just heard about how this particular process happens in reality in an international organization or other places. And I do think that it's wonderful the work that our adjuncts do all over Washington, D.C., you know, and all over the United States as well. And I certainly enjoyed tremendously when I was doing it. So it's something that I really encourage professionals to do. And on the other question, I know this is a very difficult moment to look for international law opportunities, especially because of COVID-19. Especially because we're all working virtually. But the good news is that a lot of organizations in every field of international law are looking for virtual interns, you know? And I think it's a good moment to look for a virtual internship, a virtual externship. It might not be the same as doing it in person, but you're still establishing those contacts. You can still have research and writing experience. It's a way for you to get your feet wet into the field because a lot of attorneys also, you know, I work with a lot of young lawyers and they're like, I want a career in international law, but it's important to also know what you're getting into. So that's why I think it's good to do these internships, to do those externships. And I also think that it's very important to write, you know, and I always say this to young lawyers, you know, try to work on a really good article that you can publish, you know, blog. This is all very important. I like how ASO, for example, they have a lot of fora for young academics, you know, for young lawyers, you know, that are publishing work, etc. I would take advantage of those kinds of opportunities to get your work known as well. I think that's very important as well. And don't give up. I always tell young people, don't give up. Because this is a difficult field. This is not an easy field because it's not your traditional field, but it doesn't mean that it's not going to happen for you. You know, it's just that you may have to be patient. You may have to be flexible, but don't give up. If this is your bread and butter, it will happen for you. And I always tell young attorneys that the most important thing though is stay involved in some way. Like that's important. Don't lose track of it because eventually you may find an opportunity to do it. And the other thing, and it's a closing message, don't be afraid to do work in your home country. I always tell students, you know, that some of the best jobs are found domestically. Look at the amazing job that judges do in the United States. you know, prosecutors, public defenders, you know, partners at law firms. I mean, there's a lot of wonderful domestic work in a place like the United States and in other countries. Don't shy away from those opportunities just because you want to have an international law job, because being a good attorney in your country is going to help you eventually become a good international law practitioner. So don't give up. I mean, don't give up, be flexible. If the first opportunity that you receive is to do something nationally, do it, do it. You know, at the end of the day, it could be something amazing. Just be open and be flexible. Do not give up. And remember, be kind. That's very important. No matter where you are, be kind to everyone around you and be nice and remember where you're from. Don't forget that one. No matter where you are, even if you're running your own country, which happens to some of our alums, just don't forget where you come from, you know, because that's very important. Be kind to everyone.
Well, Rosa, that's a wonderful note on which to conclude. I think I certainly am feeling inspired and energized by what you've had to say today, and I'm sure that it has been inspirational for all of the people listening. So I want to thank you very much for joining us on this program, and I will return the floor to Juliana Canet.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Mark and Rosa. Has been really flying this hour with you, both of you. Good vibe. For our attendees, thank you for joining, especially the new one. Stay tuned for new program. We have another wonderful program on September 17 on the Immunity Act in the US courts. It's sponsored by ASIL and the ABA. So check our website, and if you have your bucket list, wish list for program, come forward, write to us. We can always put together an event with a very good professional. I see that many professional, new professional join. Stay in touch with us. And if you want to also offer a program, please come forward. To all of you, have a good evening. Thank you so much.